I wasn't expecting much that afternoon, just a simple repair job. The faucet in my kitchen had been dripping for weeks, each drop an irritating reminder of all the things I kept putting off. When I opened the door to the young man who had come to fix it, I didn't think his presence would linger the way it did. He looked to be in his mid-twenties, soft-spoken, polite, with the kind of easy confidence that didn't need to announce itself. He stepped inside, his boots leaving faint marks on the tiles as the rain outside thickened to a steady whisper. "I'll try not to make a mess," he said, rolling up his sleeves, his tone light but respectful. I smiled, a polite, distant kind of smile, and gestured toward the kitchen. For a while, I busied myself with small things, wiping the counter, rearranging the fruit bowl, pretending I wasn't paying attention to the way he worked. But I was. There was something calming about him, the quiet focus, the way he studied the leak like it was a puzzle that deserved patience, not frustration. I realized how rare that felt. Most people rush. He didn't. He hummed softly, a tune I didn't recognize, as if fixing my faucet was the most natural, pleasant thing in the world. When the sound of the dripping finally stopped, the silence felt fuller. I don't know why, but I offered him coffee. Maybe it was politeness, or maybe it was the way he'd glanced around my house, not judging, just curious, as though he saw it not as cluttered or lonely, but lived in. He accepted the cup with a small nod. "Thank you. Smells nice." His fingers brushed mine when he took it, just briefly, warm from the work. The moment passed, but it stayed with me longer than it should have. We sat across from each other at the table. He talked about how he'd started working early, helping his uncle with repairs since he was a teenager. I listened, really listened, more than I had to anyone in a while. His voice had this steady rhythm to it, honest and unhurried. And somewhere between stories of leaking pipes and power outages, I noticed something that caught me off guard. I was smiling, genuinely. Then he said something simple, but it reached me deeper than it should have. I had mentioned, almost offhand, that I was used to fixing things alone. He looked up from his coffee and said, "You shouldn't have to deal with all this alone." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't pity. It was kindness, quiet, grounded, and strangely disarming. I looked away, suddenly aware of the sound of rain against the window, of how the afternoon light had softened into gold. He finished his coffee, thanked me again, and left, boots leaving faint prints that would fade by evening. But when the door closed, the silence didn't feel like emptiness anymore. It felt like the start of something I couldn't yet name, something that began with a voice, a glance, and a kindness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. That was the day he first stepped into my house. And, though I didn't know it yet, it wouldn't be the last time. At first, I thought his second visit was just coincidence. The loose cabinet hinge, the flickering hallway light, all little things I could have ignored, but when he texted to ask if there was anything else I needed help with, I found myself saying yes before thinking twice. He arrived in the late afternoon again, sunlight spilling through the window behind him as he set his toolbox down with an easy smile. It wasn't the kind of smile that asked for attention, it was the kind that quietly offered it. "Still dripping," he teased, glancing at the sink. I shook my head, hiding a grin. "No, you fixed that perfectly. I just needed help with a few small things." Those few things turned into hours. The sound of tools faded into conversation. We talked about music, how he liked old songs with soft guitars and rough voices, the kind my ex-husband used to call too sentimental. I played one from my phone, half expecting him to laugh at it, but instead, he closed his eyes for a second, as if listening meant something to him. "That's good," he said quietly. "It sounds like a memory." The comment lingered between us, simple but profound. As he worked, he'd ask gentle questions, where I grew up, what I used to love doing before life got busy. I told him I used to paint. He asked to see something I'd made. I laughed, embarrassed, saying it had been years. "Then maybe it's time to start again," he said without looking up, voice soft but certain. Somehow, that suggestion warmed me more than the coffee I was holding. When I walked past him, our shoulders brushed. Just that, a small, passing touch, yet it sent a quiet pulse through me, unexpected and uninvited. He didn't react, or maybe he chose not to. Instead, he kept talking about how he'd always liked working with his hands, how fixing things gave him peace. I realized that was what drew me to him, that sense of calm, of knowing where to place his energy, while I still felt scattered inside my own home. As the sky darkened, I found myself wishing he'd stay a little longer. He didn't notice the way I lingered at the table after he finished tightening the screws, or how I hesitated before saying goodbye. When he reached for his cup, his fingers brushed mine again. Accidental, maybe. But this time, we both froze for half a second, eyes meeting over the rim of the mug. It wasn't dramatic. No movie lighting, no music swelling in the background. Just a heartbeat, steady, shared, and quietly disarming. Then he looked down, smiled faintly, and said, "I'll see you next week." That cabinet still needs one more screw. After he left, I sat on the couch, listening to the faint echo of his laughter still clinging to the walls. There was no reason for him to come back again, not really. But I had a feeling he would. And if I was honest with myself, I hoped he would too. It started with the little things. A towel left crumpled on the counter, a stack of unopened mail, dishes waiting for hours, details I usually hid from visitors, details I told myself didn't matter. But he noticed them, not with judgment, but with care. One late afternoon, he came by to fix a wobbly chair in the living room. I had been tidying up, trying to pretend I had everything under control, when I realized he'd already started picking up some of the clutter on his own. "Let me help," he said, brushing a stack of papers into order. His voice was calm, gentle, but there was something in it that made me stop mid-motion and watch him. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't felt in years, like he could see the parts of my life I usually kept hidden. And, strangely, that felt comforting. I sighed and sank into the couch, letting him move around my living room, fixing small things without asking. His hands were steady as he adjusted a crooked picture frame, as if he had a natural rhythm for fixing not just furniture, but spaces, and maybe people too. I watched his profile, the way the soft light from the window caught the slight curve of his jaw, the gentle movement of his hands. "Do you ever stop?" I asked quietly, more to myself than to him. He paused, looking at me, and then smiled. "Stop noticing what needs fixing? Not really. I guess I like seeing things made right, in small ways." Something in that answer resonated with me. It wasn't about perfection. It was about care, attention, patience. The kind of patience I hadn't seen from anyone in years. I shifted slightly, hesitating, then began talking about my divorce, about the nights when the house felt too quiet, about the exhaustion I carried. At first, I thought I'd overstepped, but he didn't flinch. He listened. Really listened. His eyes held no pity, no judgment, just attention, calm and grounding, like the steady ticking of a clock in a room too full of silence. "You've done so much for everyone else," he said softly, brushing a stray hair from my shoulder as he passed behind me. "You don't have to carry it all alone." The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but it left warmth lingering where it had brushed my skin. I looked at him, and for the first time in months I felt seen, not as a mother, not as a professional, not as someone doing too much, but as myself. He smiled again, quietly, and I realized I wanted to see him smile that way again, to hear his voice say things that felt like permission to let my guard down. The clock ticked on, unnoticed, as I allowed myself a small, secret hope that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to fix everything alone. When he finally packed up his tools, I noticed I was reluctant to let him leave. I didn't say anything, didn't have to. He seemed to understand anyway, giving me a quiet nod, a glance that lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing had shifted outwardly. But inside, something had changed. He had noticed what others never did, the quiet cracks, the small weariness, and he had responded not with judgment, but with care. And that simple, quiet attention made me realize I was beginning to see him differently too. That night began like any other, ordinary and unremarkable, but by the time the lights went out, nothing felt the same. A sudden power outage left the entire street shrouded in darkness, and I found myself fumbling for candles. When he arrived to check on a small electrical box he had repaired earlier, I didn't expect to share the quiet evening with him. The living room smelled faintly of rain and wax as we lit the candles, their flickering flames casting soft shadows across his face. I couldn't look away. There was a warmth in him I had never noticed before, subtle but undeniable, the way his eyes caught the light, the small tilt of his head when he listened, and the effortless calm in his posture. We sat together on the couch, not touching at first, just breathing in the strange intimacy that only silence can bring. Outside, the rain drummed softly against the window, a rhythmic backdrop to the unspoken tension growing between us. The shadows danced across the room, and in the flickering light, the familiar space of my living room felt entirely new, almost sacred. For the first time, he spoke about himself in a way that was unguarded. He told me about feeling too young to be taken seriously, about the nights he worried that people might underestimate him, that he might not measure up. His voice, low and steady, filled the quiet, and I realized how much I wanted to reach out, to tell him he was already enough. I didn't. Instead, I let myself notice the details, the brush of his sleeve against my arm when he adjusted the candle, the subtle warmth of his shoulder when we shifted slightly closer to make room on the couch. Every glance and small movement carried weight, though neither of us spoke of it. The tension between us was palpable, a quiet current running beneath the surface of normal conversation. I caught his eye and hesitated, aware of the magnetic pull I had been trying to ignore. Our shoulders brushed again, closer this time, lingering just enough for me to feel a rush of warmth, a jolt of something I couldn't name. He looked down, but I could see the faint curve of a smile, like he too was aware of the shift, a mutual recognition of a closeness neither of us had anticipated. The room felt smaller, more intimate, yet somehow expansive. In the soft candlelight, every sound, the crackle of wax, the distant rumble of thunder, the quiet tap of rain, became magnified. I realized I had been waiting for this moment without knowing it, the first evening where the world outside had fallen away, leaving only the two of us. By the time the power returned, I felt a subtle, irrevocable change. The way he looked at me, the calm patience in his gestures, the way the quiet had made room for something unspoken yet understood, it all made me see him differently. That night, sitting so close on the couch, nothing had been said explicitly, yet everything had shifted. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of something I had long denied, a connection that was deeper, quieter, and far more significant than I had allowed myself to imagine. And I knew, even then, that nothing would ever feel entirely the same again. Morning arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the world itself wanted to give us time to linger in the aftermath of the night before. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, painting the living room in warm gold and dust motes that danced lazily in the still air. The house smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth, mingling with the lingering scent of the candles from the night prior. I moved through the kitchen, pretending to busy myself with breakfast, though my mind kept drifting to him, to the way he had been so near, so calm, so alive with presence, and yet untouched by any expectation or judgment. His proximity on the couch, the brush of his shoulder against mine, the brief, deliberate touches, all of it replayed in slow motion in my mind. When he arrived that morning, it was as if the air between us had shifted imperceptibly. He greeted me with the same casual warmth, but I could feel it, the tension, the pause, the subtle awareness in his eyes that lingered a heartbeat longer than usual. We carried on with small talk, jokes about spilled coffee, the weather, trivial household things, but under it all was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of what had passed. He fixed the squeaky door hinge with practiced ease, hands steady, but I noticed him glance my way often, almost as if checking for my reaction, and I found myself catching his eye more than once. Each time, a fleeting flicker of emotion passed between us, a shared understanding, a subtle pulse that neither dared name aloud. When I handed him a towel after he washed his hands, our fingers brushed, slightly longer than necessary. A shiver ran through me, and I thought I caught the same hesitation in him. Yet neither of us commented, neither of us moved away. It was a quiet intimacy, the kind that doesn't need words to be felt. I realized in that moment how much I had been craving it without fully admitting it, the small, deliberate gestures, the gentle proximity, the unspoken care. I found myself stealing glances at him while he worked, watching the light catch the curve of his jaw, the way he leaned just slightly over the sink, the subtle ease of his movements. There was something grounding about him, something that made my own restless energy settle in a way I hadn't known was possible. And yet, there was confusion too. I caught myself hesitating before speaking, analyzing each smile, each glance. Was this affection? Was it something more? The questions hung between us, unspoken but present, a delicate tension that neither of us wanted to disturb with words. By the time he left, I realized how deeply the night and morning had changed me. The air of quiet intimacy, the lingering touches, the stolen glances, it had stirred something I wasn't ready to name, something that made my chest ache in the most unexpected way. I closed the door behind him, the sound echoing softly in the hallway, and felt the absence immediately. Yet with that absence came a strange sense of anticipation. I knew, somehow, that this was not the end, that our connection, fragile and unspoken, had begun to take root. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope that the days to come might bring more than casual repairs. That evening, the house was quieter than usual. The soft hum of the night outside seeped through the slightly cracked window, mingling with the faint aroma of tea I had just brewed. He had come over to check the creaky living room window, but somehow, as he always did, the work became secondary. We ended up sitting across from each other at the table, the teacups steaming between us, our conversation drifting from mundane repairs to matters neither of us had addressed before. I had rehearsed this moment in my head countless times, the words I wanted to say, the way I might sound, the fear of what might follow. Yet when I finally opened my mouth, it wasn't rehearsed at all. I've been scared, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Scared of what people would think, of what this, us, might look like. He leaned back slightly, eyes soft, and for a moment said nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was a space that held possibility, a gentle pause where we both could breathe. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, measured, yet filled with a certainty I envied. Then don't think about them. Think about you. The simplicity of it, the sincerity, struck me deeply. For the first time, I realized that this connection, the quiet evenings, the lingering touches, the shared glances, wasn't about what the world might say. It was about us. I felt tears prick the edges of my eyes. I looked down, trying to hide them, but he reached across the table, his hand brushing mine with a tenderness that made my chest tighten. It wasn't an overstatement of passion, but a subtle, grounding gesture that said, "Without words, I see you. I'm here." I met his gaze then, and in that steady, reassuring look, something inside me shifted. I spoke again, more freely this time, about my fears, about feeling too old, too tired, too inexperienced in love to take a risk like this. And he listened, really listened, without interrupting, without judging, without offering empty platitudes. When I paused, uncertain if I had shared too much, he leaned closer, just enough for our foreheads to almost touch, and whispered, "You're braver than you know. And it's okay to feel what you feel." That simple acknowledgement broke something inside me, a dam I hadn't realized had held back so much. I felt a warmth spreading through me, a mixture of relief, longing, and a quiet joy that was both unexpected and inevitable. We sat there for a long time, hands intertwined, sharing a silence that was no longer empty but full of understanding and unspoken desire. The night deepened around us, yet inside, the air felt charged with possibility. By the time he finally stood to leave, the tension had shifted from uncertainty to a gentle certainty. I realized I had voiced what I had kept hidden, and in doing so, I had allowed a bridge to form, fragile, delicate, yet unshakably real. That night, I didn't just admit my feelings. I allowed myself to feel them fully, without fear, without apology. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that the connection we shared could be something lasting, something worth exploring, step by careful step. I remember that night vividly, even though it began like any other quiet evening. The soft hum of the city outside had faded into a gentle hush, leaving only the muted glow of the living room lamp. He had come over to help with a minor repair, the hinge on my bedroom door, but somehow, as always, the task became secondary. We found ourselves sitting together on the couch, side by side, the air between us charged with something neither of us had fully named. The room was bathed in warm light, shadows flickering across the walls, and I became acutely aware of the subtle details, the brush of his shoulder as he leaned closer to inspect the hinge, the way his fingers lingered briefly on the screwdriver before handing it to me, the faint scent of rain clinging to his jacket. Every small gesture seemed magnified in the quiet, each one carrying a weight I hadn't anticipated. We spoke little at first, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. It wasn't awkward, it was intimate. The kind of intimacy that doesn't require words, only presence. And as we sat there, side by side, our legs nearly touching, I realized something profound. I saw him differently now. Not as the young man who came to fix things in my home, but as someone who had slowly, patiently, allowed himself to enter my world, someone whose presence had begun to feel like a balm to the loneliness I hadn't fully admitted I carried. His gaze met mine, steady and calm, and I felt the same tremor I had the first night we shared that quiet candlelit living room. The unspoken tension that had always lingered between us seemed to solidify into something undeniable. I felt the warmth of his hand brush mine, this time deliberate, yet gentle. I didn't pull away. I wanted the moment to linger, to stretch on, to exist outside of time. We talked then, quietly, about trivial things, a book I had left on the table, a song that had played on the radio that afternoon, yet each word was layered with something deeper. Every laugh, every glance, every slight movement conveyed unspoken understanding. There was no need to rush, no need to define or label. Just presence. Just this. As the night deepened, I realized the truth. That night on the couch had changed the way I saw him, yes, but also the way I saw myself. In his presence, I felt lighter, freer, more willing to embrace emotions I had long buried under routine and caution. I realized that connection, patience, and genuine care could arrive unexpectedly, quietly, and yet leave a mark that felt permanent. By the time he rose to leave, the world outside had faded entirely from my mind. We lingered for a moment at the doorway, hands brushing, eyes holding, and in that brief pause, I understood that something significant had begun, delicate, slow, and entirely real. As the door closed behind him, the room felt emptier, yet somehow fuller than ever. That quiet night hadn't just changed the way I saw him, it had opened a space in my heart for possibility, for trust, for affection. And though we hadn't spoken of the future, I knew one thing for certain. What had begun here, in the quiet of my living room, was something that would stay with me forever.